All right, the floor is yours, Jenny.
All right, thank you so much, Brianne, and thank you all for joining me early this Friday morning. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and do some brief introductions, and then I do want to talk through your responses to this. So I am going to be talking about reflective practice for library workers. My name is Jenny Dale from UNC Greensboro, as Brianne just said. And this is a topic that is really important to me, but it's also a topic that I probably don't focus on enough in my own work and in my own practice. So working on this presentation, I did sort of a similar one for some of my colleagues at UNCG recently, but I found that trying to teach folks or trying to talk to folks about reflective practice really made me kind of re-engage with the process. So I'm very excited to be here today talking about this. And I am going to show you your responses, and I'm excited to see what you had to say. So I asked you in this first question how you would define reflective practice. And I was hoping that many of you would say, I don't know, or I'm not sure, because then I would have some things to share with you today. But I also see lots of folks who do have some ideas about it, making time to think about our work, thoughtfully considering our experiences, active self-examination, an attention to continual reflection and learning. I like that. That's a nice one. There are just lots of great responses here. And I'm going to give you the link to the slideshow in just a moment. When the presentation is over, I will embed the results to this in there so you can kind of get a sense of what your colleagues say about this. And then let's see. Oops. I want to get to the next one. So I also asked you then, thinking about your responses there, oh, this is cool. Thinking your responses there, if you think you actually engage in this reflective practice process. And we are tied with one outlier. 21 of you say yes, one person says no, and 21 of you say, I'm not sure. So I'm hoping that by the end of this session, those of you who are not sure will have a better sense of whether or not you do engage in this process. And I also hope that even for those of you who might be a little more seasoned in reflective practice, this gives you an opportunity to, refresh or recommit to that practice. All right, so as promised, the link to the slides, which I will also put in the chat, is go.uncg.edu/rpnclaslides. And this should take you right to this slide deck. If you have any issues with it, please let me know. And I will put this in again at the end, just so that, again, you're able to get back to it. So I want to give you a little background to just kind of get started with what it is that we're actually talking about. A lot of people trace the idea of reflective practice in a workplace back to John Dewey, the sort of, well-known US educator, and his work on reflective thought. So he talks about reflective thought in a book called How We Think, a restatement of the relation of reflective thinking to the educative process. And what he says, and I left his emphasis in here because he makes this point and wants it to be very important to people who are reading, that reflective thought is active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the grounds that support it, and the future conclusions to which it tends constitutes reflective thought. So he talks about reflective thinking and reflective thought aiming at a conclusion. You're not just thinking for the sake of thinking, you're thinking in order to come to some sort of conclusion that is important in some way to you, to your work, to your learning, to your practice. And he also says that reflective thought and reflective thinking, one of the other purposes of it is to impel you to inquiry. So to encourage you to think more and think more deeply. In the professions, in 1983, Donald Shern wrote a book called The Reflective Practitioner. This really like the main thing that people cite when they talk about reflective practice and reflective practitioners. And what he wanted to do in that book is really look at people in professions, the active professions. He looks at people in law, he looks at people in architecture, just people in all kinds of professions, to sort of look at how they reflect on practice. So rather than what he calls technical rationality, which is sort of empirical theory, or I guess empirically driven theories about how things work, he wanted to look at how practitioners actually did stuff and then what they thought about how they did it. So he talks about reflection being an important part of the process of understanding what you do and why you do it. He distinguishes between reflection in action and reflection on action. Reflection in action is interesting and to me challenging. He says here, it hinges on surprise. So if everything about our day and about our work, so for me, I'm primarily a teaching librarian. So if I'm going through teaching a class and everything is going as expected, I'm probably not going to engage in reflection in action unless I make a really concerted effort to do so. Because typically you're going to engage in this reflection in action if something surprises you, something goes wrong, something goes right in a way that you weren't expecting, or something just happens that's very different than what you were anticipating. So he says, when intuitive performance leads to surprises, pleasing and promising or unwanted, so again, the good, the bad, the helpful, the not so helpful, we might immediately sort of naturally respond by reflecting on what's happening at that moment. But most of the things I'm going to talk about today, I would consider falling more into the reflection on action, because often we have a little more space after the fact to reflect on something that happened. And when I say something, I mean, again, an experience, a class, an interaction with a coworker, an interaction with a patron, an email exchange, really kind of anything that you might be doing at work that maybe surprises you and that maybe you want to reflect on. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically right now. I want to kind of zoom in on libraries. So reflective practice in libraries, we do see some of it in the library literature. There was a column in American Libraries that Meredith Farkas wrote a couple of years ago, and it's called Looking Back to Look Forward, I think. And she talks about some of the recent findings in librarianship about reflective practice, particularly how it might help us become more culturally competent in our work and how it can help us foster inclusive library environments. But we can also draw on reflective practice research and praxis from other professions: nursing, social work, teaching, teacher education, law, and there are other professions that really engage in this a lot and write about it a lot, and we can find a lot there that I think we can draw into our own environment. Two of the main sort of empirical studies of reflective practice in libraries. The first was in 2014, Grinnell and Sin, who surveyed library and information staff across the United Kingdom. And those responses, people talked about the benefits that they get from reflective practice. And those benefits included learning from significant incidents. This is a big theme. A lot of times you are, when you're doing reflection, especially reflection on action, you are thinking about experiences that were in some way significant or critical to you. They might be, again, good, bad, somewhere in between, neutral, but they're going to be probably surprising and significant. Another was continuing professional development. We also have identification of skill and knowledge gaps and identification of strengths and weaknesses. These are all sort of benefits that the respondents to their survey said they got from reflective practice. But there are lots of barriers to reflective practice. I don't want it to seem like we can all just jump into this reflective practice and be doing it all day, every day. The biggest barrier that people often identify, and definitely identified in this study, is a lack of time. But there's also a lack of motivation and a lack of guidance or training, people not being sure quite how to do it. Miller, in 2020, a pretty recent article, replicated the same study, but she used health science librarians across the United States. And she identified very similar themes in their responses. The top 5 benefits that these health sciences librarians identified was, again, learning from significant incidents, again, strengths and weaknesses, identifying skill and knowledge gaps, achieving perspective, and improving planning. And I think this is important because to me, when we reflect on something that maybe didn't go so well, it can be hard to do that, and it can make you feel really critical of yourself and your work. But if you try to frame it a little more positively to think how you can improve for the future, I think it's a little less emotional labor. Top 5 barriers, again, time. Lack of time, lack of training, lack of guidance, lack of knowledge, and lack of organizational support. So similar responses to these 2 surveys, although this lack of organizational support came out a little more strongly in the Miller study in 2020. You can also see throughout the LIS literature, and I do have references at the end if you want to explore any of these more, as well as a shared Zotero library that I'll link for you. But I see in the literature LIS practitioners using reflective practice very often in teaching, and I've given a couple of examples here, to reflect on and improve their instruction, their training, just their overall sort of approach to teaching. To self-assess cultural competence, to assess library programming, to assess a professional development program. We have people in leadership roles who talk about using it for strategic planning and developing strategies. We've seen it used to guide peer mentoring programs, which I think is a really interesting opportunity. And in case we have any online learning librarians here, I know we do. There's also a really interesting article where 2 librarians used reflective practice in considering how they wanted to add student learning outcomes to online learning tools. And there's a lot more. These are just some examples that sort of spoke to me. So we see that people are doing this, and we see that people are finding benefits from it, but we do also see that there are barriers in our field as well as many other fields. So I want to talk a little bit about the how people can do reflective practice. You might, hopefully at this point, you're kind of convinced, or at least on the fence about the why, that we should do it, that we get benefit from it. But it's easy then to get stuck on the how. What does it look like? How do I do it? So I'm going to talk about a few cycles, practices, and lenses. I just want to say I'm scratching the surface here gently. So there are lots of different ways that you can actually explore and learn more about reflective practice. I'm always happy to talk about it. I have a growing Zotero library, like I mentioned, that leads me to other resources. But I want to hit on a few today that have been useful to me. Gibbs reflective cycle is one that is used very frequently when people in librarianship, I've seen at least a few articles in librarianship, but a lot of articles in other fields, especially teaching and teacher education. This is a reflective cycle that is used quite a bit. And I'm going to go through an example with you of how I can apply it to something that is part of my recent work. So Gibbs cycle, and I have a link here, so when you are able to, when you're in my slides, this is a hot link, if we still say that. The University of Edinburgh has a reflection toolkit that's really amazing. This is one thing that I would definitely dig into if you're interested in learning more, or if you're interested in just getting some different ideas and different frameworks. But the Gibbs reflective cycle is description, feelings, evaluation, analysis, conclusion, and action plan. And you see that after the action plan, you get back to a description again. So the idea is that when you're reflecting, you're always reflecting. Maybe not all the time every day, but you're always going to be getting back to it. So I'm going to go through a recent example using these steps. So I have periodically in my role at UNCG led these series that I call Teaching Tuesdays, where mostly in the past liaison librarians have come together to look at teaching related literature, and we read an article and just kind of have an open discussion about it. This summer, I wanted to try that in an online format, since many of us are still working from home at least part of the time. And I wanted to have a focus on anti-racist pedagogy. So we had our first meeting this week, and I have been reflecting on it quite a bit and wanted to just use this as an example. So the feelings phase, I was excited because we had a great group of people who signed up, and it made me happy that people were interested in this kind of topic and this kind of session. But I was also nervous because I haven't facilitated something quite like this online. It's a pretty serious topic. It was a completely discussion-based session, and that's something that I just don't have a lot of experience doing online. During the session, I felt really awkward. I felt like I had kind of done a bad job structuring it, and that that what I had thought would work just felt a little off. So I was actually reflecting in action on this, but I did a lot more reflection on action after the fact. I was happy that people wanted to attend more sessions, even after me feeling kind of awkward about it. But I'm really nervous about being able to effectively facilitate in the future. So I'm trying to think a little bit from a planning perspective. My evaluation, I think overall the conversation went well because the participants had a lot of important insights to share. The discussion didn't flow the way that I imagined it flowing at all. So in that way, it didn't go as well as I hoped because it didn't match really what I was anticipating. But again, participants were providing a lot of insight really organically, and some of my prepared questions actually shut down conversation from my perspective. So as I'm analyzing this, as I'm thinking more, so from evaluation, evaluation is what went well and what didn't, and analysis is more like why. So I thought more about this, and I think the discussion went well overall because these are self-selected participants. These are people who wanted to be involved in this conversation, and they're interested in the topic at hand. So I don't think it went as well as I liked because my conversations weren't right. They seemed to interrupt an open flow of conversation. And also the article I selected, if I'm really being honest, was maybe a little dense and might have been more useful for some individual reflection before a group discussion. If I knew how my colleagues felt about the discussion in kind of an authentic way, it might help me better understand like what the perception was outside of my own. But I'm still really right at this point working through my own perception. So the conclusions that I drew here, a more open discussion format might be better for an article like this that was a sort of dense. There was a theory, there was practice, there was praxis, there was a lot happening in this article, and it was really laying some groundwork for future conversations. I also think it could have been more positive if I had more directly involved participants in the session ahead of time in some way. And I am going to consider assessing sessions like this, even when they're informal, even when they're small, even when it might make me feel weird to say, hey, the 7 of you who are here, please fill out this anonymous form about what happened. So my action plan is that for the next Teaching Tuesday, I'm going to try to make the participants more actively involved in the process of selecting the source that we're going to use, as well as maybe contributing discussion questions or other ideas using a format like Google Docs. I also want to figure out how I can do some like low-key assessment that won't make people feel like they have to go through a sort of full evaluative process, but they can help me get a sense of their perceptions. So that's an example of Gibbs, me going through that. And one of the things that is nice about this example, one of the reasons I chose it, is that there will be another Teaching Tuesday, and I can just directly go back into that cycle again. I want to talk a little bit about a simplified cycle, and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to take a few minutes and try this with some sort of recent work experience. Again, an email, a conversation, a class you taught, a tutorial you created, a conversation that you had, really anything like that. And this cycle is modified from a book by Borton in 1970 called Reach, Touch, and Teach, Student Concerns and Process Education, and it is often referred to as the what, so what, now what cycle. So just those 3 phases, but those phases can be very rich and give you a lot of great reflective information. So I'm going to ask you all to take a couple of minutes here. I'm going to set a timer, and I'm going to awkwardly mute myself in a real presentation setting, or not real, this is real. In a face-to-face setting, I would be walking around talking to people, but I can't do that here. So I'm just going to mute myself for 3 minutes. And I'm setting a timer, and I want y'all to consider something that happened to you recently that you want to reflect on. And here are some questions that can help guide you in that process. All right, my very loud timer just went off and surprised me. So it's been 3 minutes, and I actually just want to take this opportunity to ask if anyone is willing to share what they reflected on, just a sort of quick overview. And if you are, you can use the hand raise icon that you should be able to see, I think, in your participant window. I should have checked that earlier. Or you can type in the chat as well, but it's also completely optional. All right, seeing no hand raises and no chats, I will move ahead. Sometimes it can be helpful to talk through reflective practice with someone else. Maybe not in a situation like this where there are 64 people in this room, many who may not know each other, but taking time to reflect, I think, is really important. And yes, thank you, Libby, in the chat. You're welcome for giving you time to reflect. That's one of the things I like to do in a session like this, and there will be a couple more opportunities as we go through. All right, so I want to talk about Brookfield. Stephen Brookfield is an amazing advocate of critically reflective practice, specifically critically reflective teaching practice. If you are a teaching librarian or engaged in teaching or training in any way, I really recommend his book, Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. But he has also written quite a bit of other literature about reflective practice. And he defines critically reflective practice as a process of inquiry. So back to that inquiry that Dewey talked about, involving practitioners in trying to discover and research the assumptions that frame how they work. So he's talking about digging into what the assumptions are about your work. What do you do that is just sort of comes naturally to you because you assume that it's going to be effective. And again, his focus is on teachers, but I see lots of applications sort of more widely from Brookfield. So he talks about 4 lenses to use for your critical reflection. The first is our autobiography as a learner. I think we can also consider this our autobiography as an employee, as a worker, as a library worker, thinking about what experiences we've had in the past and how they come to bear on how we practice now. He talks about our learner's eyes. Again, I think we can also consider our colleagues' eyes. So if I think about the Gibbs cycle example that I gave, one of the ways that I could engage my colleagues is by asking them to trust me enough to share their responses with me. And trust is key there. It's really important. And to build that trust, you really have to model that you're willing to take constructive feedback and that you're willing to take it graciously and sort of in the way that it's meant. Brookfield recommends a really specific document that he calls a critical incident questionnaire, which you may have come across at some point. He uses it in teaching, so he asks his students to fill out this critical incident questionnaire at the end of a course, like a week of class or at the end of a specific class. But you can, again, also, I think, do this in lots of other ways. And there are great examples of critical incident questionnaires all over the internet. And you can always contact me if you want to know more, and I can give you some examples that I've used. Also, talking to our colleagues, he talks a lot about how one of the benefits of critically reflective practice is that it sort of raises what he calls the shroud around the work that we do, that we don't necessarily, we're not always talking to other people about what's happening to us at work or experiences we're having. And when we start to have that conversation or those conversations with other people, it might reveal that others are sharing these kinds of experiences or others have unique perspectives on those. And then his 4th lens, which I have put lens 4 on here twice, apologies, is the theoretical literature. And he talks about the importance of theory to help us name things that we're experiencing. So this goes back to the assumptions. So there might be things that we assume and we just do, again, kind of naturally in our work because we have learned as professionals and as practitioners that they are effective. And those can sometimes be named by theory. We might be able to find theoretical background that helps us understand and name the things that we're doing. So those are his 4 lenses. I definitely, again, recommend Brookfield if you're interested in this critically reflective practice. A similar perspective comes from Larrabee, another teacher education professional. And she talks about 3 essential practices for critically reflective practice. So the first is making time. This is, as we saw in some of the research earlier, this is a huge barrier for people with any kind of reflective practice. Making time. She ideally would say daily practice. Her recommended option is for reflective journaling. That might work for some people. It doesn't work for others. There are lots of other options that you can use there. You could think about the cycles that we talked about, either Gibbs or the what, so what, now what, or there are many others. And you could do free journaling. You can look out in the literature and see what have other people done. That's a way that I have gotten a lot of ideas and adapted sort of templates that other people have made. She also talks about becoming a perpetual problem solver. You're always trying to solve problems, and you're always thinking about how what we have learned in the past can help us in the future as well as the present. And then questioning the status quo is big for her. So again, just because we have always done something one way doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way. We need to question our own assumptions, and we need to question more like larger, even profession-wide conventional wisdom. So I want to give you a little more opportunity to do some reflection. And as I mentioned, sort of before I go into this, I've just given you a few examples that I've selected really from my own experience and preferences, but there's so much out there that I think can really help anyone get started with this kind of practice or keep going or change the way that they do reflective practice. But I wanted to give you a little more opportunity to do this reflection. And I'm going to pull in this little segment here from work from Tony Gay from 2011, from Teaching and Learning Through Reflective Practice, a practical guide for positive action. And what I learned from this text is that framing really matters when we're thinking about reflection. I know for me, and I'm sure for many of you, when we start to get into a cycle of reflection, it might be easy to really be down on ourselves and be extra critical of what we did and you know, sort of spiral out about what we could have done better. He talks about changing your focus from a deficit model or deficit-based questions, like you can potentially, hopefully see here on the slide, reframing them as strengths-based questions. So for example, if you're reflecting on an incident and you think, what's the problem? That's important. I don't want to say that you shouldn't think about problematic aspects of things that happened or things that didn't go well. But you could also, at the same time, have a sort of a simultaneous conversation with yourself about what was successful. So you can think about what happened that might have been problematic, as well as what happened that might have been amazing and wonderful. So I'm going to guide you through a little bit from Tony Gay's book. He focuses a lot on strengths-based reflections, which I like. I think many of us don't focus on our strengths quite enough. So I'm going to ask you, again, this is going to be a silent reflection for yourself. I'll set a shorter timer this time, probably 2 minutes. But I'm going to ask you to think about both of these sets of questions right here, or just one, however you want to do. In his book, he says his actual question is, what was your best day at work in the past 3 months? I imagine for most of us, we haven't had a lot of great days at work in the past 3 months. So I extended it to a year. Remember back then, and think about that. What made that the best day? What happened? What were you doing? Or thinking about the best recognition you've ever received at work. These are things that can really help us not only identify our own strengths, but identify the ways that we the ways that we work best, how we're rewarded best, what happens on a day that we consider best, that kind of thing. So I'm going to set that 2-minute timer. I'm going to mute myself. I'll let y'all do some more reflection. All right, once again, my very loud duck timer has frightened me. So here we are, it's been 2 minutes. Just like I did before, I want to give you all the optional opportunity to share if you would like, either in the chat or by raising your hand, and I can, I think, unmute you. One of the things I think about when I reflect on these kinds of questions, particularly that second question about recognition received, is I think about recognition that I get from in my liaison work, particularly from students and faculty I work with. And that helps me understand like what kind of recognition actually matters to me, and how can I seek that out? Oh, great, we have someone. Scott, I can unmute you if you would like to share.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Well, I'll do the second one. The first one was tough because I've been furloughed for 4 months and it's hard to even think about work. But the best recognition I probably ever had was when I worked in the children's department of a public library, and I used to do story time. And a dad who had brought his little boy with him all summer, the dad came up to me and said, you know, it's been exciting, you know, watching you do the story time, and my little boy doesn't really talk. He hasn't, you know, been talking at all, but because he sees you as a man doing the story time, he thinks it's so exciting, and that he sings all the songs on the car ride home. And that was the first time we've ever really heard him engage and talk. So that was probably the best recognition I've ever had in my career so far.
Yeah, I think so. That's awesome. That's a great one.
And it was, and like you say, reflective. It was something I was just doing because that was my job and I loved doing it and it was so much fun. And to know that you had such a profound effect on someone and you didn't even realize you were doing that is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think, you know, those are things that we don't give ourselves a lot of credit for. So I think that's really awesome. And you're getting a lot of love in the chat for that story. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
There's also an example in the chat from Rachel. So I'm going to read that out loud for the posterity of the recording. A patron was having problems with overdrive and reading ebooks on multiple devices. Who hasn't been there? And I figured out what the problem was and was able to figure out a solution. She was able to do what she wanted to do with reading ebooks. Very similar to Scott's story that we just heard. You know, these are the kind of things that we might, if we didn't take the time to reflect on, it might just be like, you know, a day in the life. This is something that we did. But when we take time to reflect, especially on these things, it really helps us identify our strengths as well as where we draw our energy from at work. And for a lot of us, I think it's that problem-solving orientation that Larrabee talks about. All right, we've got one from Cassie here. My best days have always involved student success or expressing excitement about learning a new skill. One of my most meaningful moments of recognition was from a student who, on the last day that we were on campus before shutdown, thanked me for always saying hello to them, offering to help them, and for inviting them to a scalar workshop that they enjoyed and would be using in their classes for a personal project. I love that too, Cassie. I had a student when I taught them Zotero who came back and told me that they like shared it with their mom, and now their mom uses it to like keep stuff that she finds online. And those moments where you get to hear that things are happening that go well beyond the interaction that you've had, those are, I think, really rewarding as well. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate all of the sharing. And you're right, Libby says we have to tell our stories too so others know the awesome work librarians do. I don't think there's been a lot of discussion of this in our field. I think it's hard for a lot of library workers to kind of sing their own praises because it makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I think it's really important to do that. And I think reflective practice is a way that we can become more comfortable with that, because you kind of start with yourself. Rachel Olson loves singing her own praises. As well you should, Rachel. You have much to sing about. All right. I'm going to do a couple more with you that are based on Gay's book. I've adapted them from here, and I will then move into talking a little bit about planning for the future. But I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to mute myself and give y'all a couple of minutes, And this is, again, you can think about what you wrote down or thought about for the last slide, but you can also think about other things that might not be related. But I want you to consider a major strength of yours, when you get to use it at work, how you feel, and what needs to change to make that strength something you can use or draw on more often at work. Again, let's maybe think of work in a more normal setting, but even right now, for those of us who aren't furloughed, which I know is many of us, and I apologize. Well, apologize is probably wrong, but I feel for you. All right, folks. So I hope you were able to think a little bit about your strengths, how you feel when you're able to use them, you know, what might need to change for you to be able to use them more often or draw on them as much as you can. For the sake of time, I'm going to go on to this planning document that I've created. So if you go to this link, and again, I will put it in the chat. It is another Go link from UNCG. And what it should do when you get there, Amy helped me with this, Amy Harris-Hauk, who is also presenting right now in room B, helped me make this so that it should force a copy so that you can make a copy of this document. But I am going to go ahead and open it up so you can see what it is. There we go, it worked for me, even though it's my document. So this is just a planning document that you can use to help think about how you can make time for reflective practice and how you can sort of hold yourself accountable for that time, because it's hard to do that. We have seen in this presentation already where we've talked about the literature out there. It's tough to make time for this when we all feel probably overstretched and overburdened and overworked and often underpaid or furloughed or, you know, in many dire straits right now in the world that we're in. So this just asks you to think through an area of your professional practice that you feel like would most benefit from personal reflection. So I do a lot of reflection already on my teaching because it's such an important part of my job. But one of the things that I think that I could reflect on a bit more is my liaison work. So the work I do with specific academic departments on campus. Some parts of it I feel great about, mostly the teaching parts, but I don't always feel great about my collection development that I do as part of that. I don't always feel really confident in my one-on-one consultations, and I think it would help me to reflect on that. The next question is one that I want to point out because I didn't talk about this too much, but there are a lot of different ways that you can do reflective practice. Free writing is one big one. And journaling. I am not a journaler. I've never been good at journaling. So this won't work for me. So we have lots of other options. Using an established reflective cycle, that works for me. I like rules, I like structure, I like to be able to work through something that I know is already set up, that I can work within certain parameters. Another thing that works for me is taking some of the things that I might use with my students and using them for myself. So for a while, I was doing really well at this. I'm not anymore, but I would do my own 1-minute paper after I taught a session. So if you're familiar with 1-minute papers, you often ask students one thing you learned, one thing that's still confusing, and then maybe anything else they want to share. And I did sort of a similar model for myself after every class I would teach. This gets tough time-wise, especially if you have a heavy teaching load, but I did find that really useful when I really committed to sticking with it. There are also a lot, especially in some of the examples that I shared earlier in that kind of rundown of the LIS literature. There are a lot of like templates that people have already created that you might be able to use or adapt. Collaborative reflection with a colleague. I have a link here to a presentation that I've already mentioned Amy Harris-Halkin did at the last NCLA conference about critical friendship. Critical friends can be great reflection partners. And that to me is an opportunity for many of us maybe who feel more, do more social learning or feel more engaged when we're talking and learning with someone else. But I also have other things on here, other questions. How often do you want to do it? Do you want to say, I'll do this once a week, I'll do this every day, or I'll just do this when something happens that I want to reflect on? How much time can you commit to it, and how are you going to hold yourself accountable? But then another thing that's really important is to think about what resources you need. So kind of going back to that strength-based reflection question from Gay about how you could draw on your strength more often at work, what would have to happen for that? This is kind of a similar question. What support do you need? Do you need, does your library administration need to, understand your need for reflective practice? Do you need to get a group together that would help you kind of engage in this and stay accountable? Do you want to have an email buddy that you share this information with? Do you want to put it on a blog? There are lots of ways that you can do all of these kinds of work. And one of the things that's been really important to me over the course of my career in thinking about reflective practice is that it looks different for everyone, and that's great. Don't force yourself. Like if I were to force myself to do daily reflective journaling, I would quit immediately because I wouldn't like it. It wouldn't work for me and my work style. So this will still be here. And again, that link is on my slideshow. I am going to put the slides link back up here again so that you can get back to them. And then I also want to share, you see I have a lot of citations here, but I also have I have a link to a Zotero library that is free and openly available for people to look at that I will paste in the chat as well. And so we only have a few minutes left, which I feared. But I would be happy to answer questions that people have. And you're also absolutely welcome to contact me. My email address is here. And because you can get back to the slides later, you can always find it again. I'm seeing a chat from Sam. When I first started doing instruction and programs in academic libraries at High Point University, Kathy Shields, the amazing Kathy Shields, recommended creating a Google Doc or Word document for all sessions and adding in a reflective practice piece to do right after. It was great, and this has inspired me to go back to adding it to my Google Docs. Wonderful, thank you, Sam. Sam is my colleague at UNCG, a wonderful colleague. And that is a really good idea. That would be an easy way, if that's part of your process. That's another thing I would say is, if you could just add this to your process that you already do, it's a lot easier to keep up with it. Yeah, Scott says establishing a process or routine is critical to keep up with it. You know, we always hear all these things about habits and how to make a habit, and there are those habit trackers online. And I know those work for some people. So if that's something that you like, if you like to be able, like for me, you know, I think for many of us, I love to be able to like check a box and say I did something. So if I actually set a goal every day to reflect, I'd probably be more, or every week, probably daily would work easiest for me, because that's when I would feel like I've really done something today and I could check that box off. Again, it's all very personal. Reflective practice is a personal practice. We can't force everyone to do it the same way, or it won't really, you know, meet any of its goals or have those kind of benefits. Oh, wonderful. Linda says, thanks for reflective practice document. I went from, I don't know what reflective practice is. It's a weird word when you keep saying it. To having an understanding of this and how to apply to my work and life. I'm so glad. That was my big goal for this. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I'm thinking that we might be out of time, if I'm remembering the schedule correctly. Thank you all so much for attending. I am so excited that so many people are interested in this topic. And if you are ever interested in contacting me and talking about it, I would just love to talk to you about reflective practice. You are all awesome. You can all do this, and you all have lots of amazing and wonderful strengths to draw on. And there are some great NCLA sessions today, but I have to say, I recommend Rachel Olson and Lois Barnes-Vincent's presentation. They are two of my fantastic colleagues who will be talking about writing and reading groups. So just a plug there.